Hello and welcome to today's lesson for ancient Greek. So this is not a legitimate, real lesson. I would say it's for the purpose of ASMR. Please note the article below. I'm reading from this article, and I would like to apologize in advance if I make any wrong words or any wrong pronunciation of any foreign or big words. Okay, let's go. I want to start with food and agriculture in ancient Greece. This is an article made by Mr. Mark Cartwright, 25th July 2016. Also, you can listen to this article from the website itself, ancient.eu. The prosperity of the majority of Greek states was based on agriculture and ability to produce the necessary surplus, which allowed some citizens to pursue other trades and pastimes and to create quantity of exported goods so that they could be exchanged for necessities the community lacked. Cereals, olives, and wines were three most produced foodstuffs, suited as they are to the Mediterranean climate. With the process of Greek colonization in such places such as Asia Minor, Magna Graecia, Greek agriculture practice and products spread around the Mediterranean. A network of small holdings. The state did not control farming or crops were grown, and livestock were reared by private individuals on their own land. Indeed, the widespread practice of not permitting non-residents to own land meant that small holdings were the norm. Another important factor which limited the amalgamation of land plots over time was the male children generally inherit equal shares of their parents' lands. It is not clear if farmers always lived on their farms or resided in the city or traveled each day. It seems reasonable to suppose there was a mixture of both approaches, which was probably dependent on the location of the land inherited by an individual and their personal status, such as being able to afford slaves to work the land. And now let's look at crops. The crops produced by ancient Greeks were, of course, selected for their suitability for the Mediterranean climate. This has a combination of dry, hot summers with mild winters, providing plentiful rainfall. The irregularity of annual rainfall did mean that the crop failure was a regular problem, though. So wheat crops may have failed once every 4 years, barley crops once every 10 years because of insufficient water supply. Terrain, localized weather conditions, and different soils were also factors in making some areas more fertile than others. Indeed, as a whole, only 1/5 of Greece was arable land, and so pressure to make best use of it was high. The most widely cultivated crop was wheat, especially emmer and durum, and hulled barley. Millet was grown in areas with greater rainfall. Gruel from barley and barley cakes were more common than bread made from wheat. Pulses were grown, such as broad beans, chickpeas, lentils, vines to make wine, and olives to produce olive, completed the four main types of crops in Greek world. Fruits, such as figs, apples, pears, pomegranates, quinces, and medlars. Vegetables such as cucumber, onions, garlic, and salads, and nuts, for example, almonds and walnuts, were grown by many private households. Let's look at crop management. Plowing and sowing was carried out in October, November, December. It is interesting to note that there were no distracting religious festivals and records of assembly meetings in Athens during this crucial and busy period. Vines were pruned back in early spring, and grains were harvested in May and June. Winnowing and treasuring and storage were done in June and July. While grapes were gathered, made into wine, and figs were collected in September. In an autumn, olives were harvested, pressed into oil. And during the winter, some hardier crops were sown and fields maintained. There is evidence of crop rotation, and fields were left fallow to allow soil nutrients to regenerate moisture buildup. So in more pressing times, some fields would have been used continuously throughout the year and planted with some multiple crops at the same time. Such crops as beans and lentils were also grown and re-plowed back into the field, fertilized, or wheat would be left grown as food for the grazing animals. Small plots were used for growing fruits and vegetables, would have been irrigated with small water channels and cisterns. Trenches, if laborers were available, were dug around the trees to hold precious rainwater for where it was not needed. Now, equipment used in Greek agriculture was basic, so with digging, weeding, and multiple plowing done by hand using wooden or iron-tip plows and mattocks and hoes. Richer farmers had oxen to help plow their fields. Sickles were used to harvest crops, which were then winnowed using a flat shovel and basket. Grains were then threshed on stone floor, which was trampled on by livestock. They might have been dragged by sledges for a purpose too. Grapes were crushed underfoot in wands, while olives were crushed in stone presses. I would like to read more into the ancient Greek clothing. It is under a different article. I'm going to put it under the description list. I believe it's very interesting. The ancient Greeks were not fussy about their clothing. The garments they wore were made for function, and they were made simply. A single piece of fabric could be styled and restyled to fit a particular occasion or a fashion. And with Greek summers being brutally hot, the less fabric or complicating seams to deal with, the better. Let's look at the fabrics. The fabric that the Greeks used for their clothing were sometimes spun in the home, often into a very heavy wool material, or made from linen fabric that was imported. For every member of the family, except for infants who wore nothing at all, an outfit usually consisted of a square or a rectangular piece of fabric, pins for fastening, and sometimes shoes or a hat. The pieces of fabrics were folded around the body and pinned together at the side seams and shoulders, as well as being belted. Although it might sound as if the Greeks walked around wearing plain potato sacks, there clothing would have been dyed bright colors and would have been decorated with ornate patterns. Now, types of garments. The style and type of garment depended on who was wearing it and the job or function required of a person. There were several types of garments derived from a basic tunic. A tunic was worn by both men and women and varied in length according to the job or gender. It was often tied at the waist and might also have been pinned at the seam, depending on the style of the garment. A chiton was a type of tunic worn by Greek men and was often made of a lighter linen material, as men were often outdoors more and would require more comfortable clothing, especially in the summer. It could be draped over both shoulder or only one. When it was draped over one shoulder, usually the left, it was known as an exomie, and this type of chiton was usually worn for horseback riding, work, or exercise. A peplos or a peplum was a type of tunic worn by women, usually made from a heavier wool material. And this garment was made from a large rectangular piece of fabric and could be draped and fastened with buttons, pins, brooches in different ways to reflect different types of styles. A peplos was worn as a full-length garment because a proper Greek woman revealed nothing. In colder weather, Greeks wore a cloak over their tunic for warmth, known as a himation, I think. This garment was usually made of wool and was fashioned from a rectangular piece of cloth that was draped over the person, sort of like a Roman toga. It served a dual purpose, especially for men. The himation came in handy for soldiers away from home and also serving as a warm blanket or a cold winter night. Other types of cloaks worn by Greeks include epiblema, a shawl worn by a Greek woman, and chlamys, a short cloak worn by young males. Let's look at the shoes and hats. Now, Greeks were not particularly fond of shoes, usually eschewing them, especially at home. But on special occasions or on matters of business, Greeks would wear a small sandal or boots with their tunics. However, it was not uncommon for Greeks to go barefoot for his entire life. In addition to covering their feet, the Greeks sometimes covered their heads as well. A Greek man sometimes wore a petassos, a wide-brimmed hat that helped to protect them from the summer heat. Women occasionally could be seen wearing hats that featured high-peaked crowns. This was no doubt only for the most special occasions. While certainly not fancy, Greek clothing was functional and built to last. In fact, in today's haute couture, we often see a bit of a Greek fashion influence. The columnar style of tunic, especially the women's peplos, is not an uncommon style to be worn by women today. Now let's look at the article on ancient Greek society. Although ancient Greek society was dominated by male citizen with his full legal status, right to vote, hold public office, and own property, the social group which made up of the population of typical Greek city, state, or polis was remarkably diverse. Women, children, immigrants, both Greek and foreign, laborers, slaves, all had defined roles, but there was interaction between the classes, and there was also some movement between social groups, particularly for second generation offspring during the times of stress such as wars. Now, the society of ancient Greece was largely composed of these groups. Male citizens, 3 groups: landed aristocrats, poor farmers, and the middle class, such as artisans and traders. Next group is semi-free laborers, example, helots of Sparta. Next group is women, belonging to all of the above male group but without citizen rights. Now let's look at children, categorized as below 18 years generally. And next is slaves, the douloi, who had civil or military duties. And then comes foreigners, non-resident or foreign residents who are below male citizens in status. Let's look at class. Although male citizens had by far the best positions in Greek society, and there were different classes within this group. The top of the social tree was the best people, was the aristoi, possessing more money than everyone else. This class could provide themselves with armor, weapon, a horse when military campaign. The aristocrats were often split into powerful family fractions or clans who controlled all of the important political positions in the police. Their wealth came from having property, and even more importantly, the best land, for example, most fertile, or the closest protection offered by the city walls. A poorer or the second class of citizens existed too. These were men who had land, but perhaps less productive plots, or situated a bit further from the city, and their property was less well protected than the prime lands near to the city proper. The land might be so far away that the owners had to live on it rather than travel back and forth from the city. The citizens were also called periokoi, dwellers roundabout, or even worse, dusty feet, and they collected together for protection in small village communities, subordinates to neighboring city. As city populations grew, inheritance became more divided among siblings. This secondary class grew significantly. A third group were the middle and business class, engaged in manufacturing, trade, commerce. These were the newly rich. However, aristoi jealously guarded their privileges and political monopoly by ensuring only landowners could rise into positions of real power. However, there was some movement between classes. Some could rise through accumulating wealth and influence, and others could go down a class by becoming bankrupt, which could lead to loss of citizenship or even being enslaved. Ill health, losing out on inheritance, political upheaval, or war could result in the best getting their feet a little dusty. Now let's look at the women. Female citizens had few rights in comparison to male citizens. Unable to vote, own a land, or inherit, a woman's place was in the home, and her purpose was in life was the rearing of children. Contact with non-family male was discouraged, and women occupied their time with indoor activities such as woolwork, weaving. Spartan women were treated somewhat differently than in other states. For example, they had to do physical training like men, were permitted to own land and could drink wine. Women citizens had to marry as a virgin and marriage was usually organized by the father, who chose the husband and accepted from him a dowry. If a woman had no father, then her interests were looked after by a guardian, perhaps an uncle or a male relative. Married at a typical age of 13 or 14, love had little to do with the matching of husband or wife. A husband and a wife, I'm sorry. Of course, love may have developed between the couple, but the best might hope for was the philia, a general friendship or love sentiment. Eros, the love of desire, was to be found elsewhere, at least for the males. Marriages could be ended on 3 grounds. First and foremost, most common was repudiation by the husband. No reason was necessary, only the return of the dowry was expected. Second, now that is just for no reason at all. I will divorce you. That's incredible. Wow, it's horrible. Poor woman. The second termination cause was the wife leaving the family home, and in the case, woman's new guardian was required to act as her legal representative. This was, however, a rare occurrence, and women's reputation in this society was damaged as a result. The third ground for termination was the bride's father asked for his daughter back, probably to offer her to another man with a more attractive dowry. So it's like a little commodity. Okay. This last option was only possible, however, if the wife had not had children. If a woman was left a widow, she was required to marry a close male relative in order to ensure property stayed within the family. Now, women, of course, were also present in various other non-citizen classes. The group for which we have most information is that of sex workers. Women were divided into 2 categories. First, perhaps most common, is the brothel, prostitute. Second is the higher class. And these latter women were educated in music, culture, and often formed a lasting relationship with married men. It was also a class of women entertained men at celebrated symposiums. Okay, now let's look at children and adolescents. Children of citizens attended schools where a curriculum covered reading, writing, mathematics. After these basics were mastered, studies turned into literature, poetry, music. Athletics was also an essential element in young persons' education, as at Sparta, boys as young as 7 were grouped together under the stewardship of an older youth to be toughened up with hard physical training. In Athens, young adults, citizens aged 18 to 20, had to perform civil and military service, and their education continued with lessons in politics, rhetorics, and culture. Girls too were educated in a similar manner to boys, but with a greater emphasis on dancing, gymnastics, musical accomplishments which could be shown off in musical competitions and at religious festivals and ceremonies. The ultimate goal of a girl's education was to prepare her for her role in rearing a family. Now I'm going to cut some parts of the articles which makes for a very, I would say, not a very ASMR-inducing, relaxing situations. So if you are interested in that part, you can go ahead and look into it. I'm going to continue on with the laborers part. Now let's look at the laborers. Greek society included a significantly larger proportion of laborers than slaves. These were semi-free workers, wholly dependent on their employer. The most famous example of the Helot class of Sparta these dependents were not the property of a particular citizen. They could not be sold as slave could, and they often lived with families, and generally they formed arrangement with their employers, such as giving quantity of their produce to the farm owner and keeping the rest for themselves. Sometimes the quota required them may have been high or low, and there may also have been some extra benefit for the serfs, such as protection or safety in numbers. However, serf class or helots could never achieve any real security, as they were given little or no legal status and harshly treated, even killed in regular purges. In order to instill a fear which would ensure continued subordination to the ruling class, in certain periods, such as wars, helots were required to serve in armed forces and fighting. You could even earn an escape from the lot and join the intermediary social group, which existed below the level of full citizens, and included such individuals such as children with parents of mixed status. For example, father is a citizen and mother is a helot. And now these classes really seems true to modern classes. Right now, let's look at slaves. In Greek society, slaves were seen as a necessary and perfectly normal part of city life, acquired through war and conquest, kidnap, purchase. Slaves were simply amongst life's bottom graders. That's what. There were even intellectual arguments for philosophers like Aristotle, which propounded the belief that slaves were demonstrably inferior, a product of their environment, inherited characteristics. Greeks persuaded themselves that it is that as they had the best environment and characteristics, the purest bloodline, and therefore born to rule. As in any history, it's just the same story, it's nothing new. It is impossible to say with accuracy how many slaves were in Greek society and what proportion of the population they made up. It is unlikely due to cost that every single citizen had their own slaves, but some citizens undoubtedly owned many slaves. Accordingly, estimates of slave population in Greek would range from 15 to 40% of the total population. However, a defense speech made in court case in Athens by Lysias and hints from others such as Demosthenes strongly suggest that if every citizen did not have slaves, then they certainly desired them, and to have a slave owner was considered a measure of social status. Slaves were not only owned by private individuals, but also by the states, which used them in municipal projects such as mining, or, as in case of Athens, a police force. The relationship between slaves and owners seemed to have been much as in any other period, a history mix of contempt, distrust, and abuse from owners, contempt, theft, and sabotage from enslaved. Source materials always from a viewpoint of a slave owner, but there are references to literature, particularly in Greek comedy, of a friendship, a loyalty, at least some owner-slave relationship. Whilst flogging of slaves is commonly referred as Greek plays, there were also treatises written extolling the benefits of kindness and incentives in slave management. Slaves worked in all spheres, and over 200 occupations have been identified. These include working in homes, in agriculture, industry, mines, transport, retail, banking, entertainment, in armed forces, attendants to owners and baggage carriers, as rowers, naval vessels, and also as fighters. Farms were generally small affair, with even the richest citizen tending to own several small farms rather than one large estate. Therefore, slaves were not concentrated into large groups as in later ancient societies. For slaves, there was, at least for some, a glimmer of hope to one day achieve their freedom. There are instances when slaves, particularly those involved in manufacturing industry, living separately from their owners, giving a financial independence, could pay for their freedom with the money they had saved. Also, slaves in the army were sometimes given their freedom by the state following their victorious exploits. Going to the last section on these classes of ancient Greek. I love this subject of ancient Greek a lot, and I'm very interested in it. However, the way the article is written is a little bit hard for a person to read, mainly because I'm not the one who's written it, and it's hard for a person to read it as it is. It's my word. And the article has a lot of speech writing. I don't know, like for instance, for example, blah blah blah. I don't know. As you can, if you have reached to this end, you will probably understand how much I am struggling through this article. But let's give it a last shot, yeah? Let's look into the foreigners, and this is the last class, and after this we are ending this article. Okay, foreigners. Aside from slaves, most Greek poleos would have had a number of free foreigners who had chosen to relocate from other areas of Greece, the Mediterranean, and the Near East, bringing with them skills such as pottery and metalworking. These foreigners usually had to register their residence and so become a recognized class called metics. In return for benefits of guest citizenship, they had to provide a local sponsor, pay local taxes, sometimes pay additional taxes, contribute to cost of minor festivals, and even participate in military campaigns when necessary. Despite these suspicions and prejudices against foreign barbarians, quote-unquote, which often cropped up in literary sources, there were classes when Metokoi did manage to become full citizens after a suitable display of loyalty, contribution to the good of the host state. They then received equal tax status and the right to own property and land. Their children too became citizens. However, some states, notably Sparta at the time, actively discouraged immigration or periodically expelled Sinoi. And the relationship between foreigners and local citizens seemed to have been a strained one, particularly in times of war and economic hardship. Well, that's the end of our article, and we have done it. Thank you so much for listening to my struggle through this ancient Greek, it's quote-unquote ASMR lesson. And see you on the next one.